Welcome to The Call. I'm MELINA Abdullah. The Call is a show like no other. The Call is meant to be an engagement. It's grounded in the African tradition of call and response. So rather than putting ideas out for you to process, it's meant for us to be in conversation, virtual conversation with one another. The Call is also a calling out of injustice, of systems of oppression, and of policies that are meant to keep those in power and meant to keep those of us without power disadvantaged. The Call is a calling forth. It's calling for a radical imagining of a new world, of a way in which we can all live and walk in the world in which we want to live. And finally, the Call is a call to action. We know that by taking tangible steps, we can begin to shift power. We can liberate folks from injustice. We can bring forth freedom for Black people and, by extension, all people. Welcome to The Call. I'm MELINA Abdullah. On this episode of The Call, we're going to be talking about gun violence, gun safety, and gun control. But we're going to be talking about it from the complicated perspective of Black folks. I was recently fortunate enough to travel with a group of young people from March for Our Lives and the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard to attend a presidential forum, a presidential candidates forum on gun safety. At that forum, we had a really important conversation about how gun safety disproportionately impacts Black communities, but also what gun violence means at the hands of police. So I want to tell my own story. I recently came to terms with the fact, as a Black mother and as a Black activist, I absolutely have to rely on myself for my own self-defense. And so it's really kind of hearkening back to this reality that African people have had since we arrived in this country, right? The truth that self-defense is important to our survival and our freedom. So when we think about groups like the Deacons for Defense or leaders like Robert F. Williams, or the stance that organizations like the Black Panther Party took, in Black self-defense, that's something that we cannot afford to abandon now. As a Black activist, I came to terms with the truth that Black people can't afford to call police for help. I also want us to think about a complication around police violence being gun violence. It's something that the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard has been lifting up for the last 2.5 years after the Parkland shooting, right? They've been talking about police violence is absolutely gun violence. We were encouraged to hear candidate Julian Castro reiterate those words. But we're also sorrowful about why he had to reiterate those words. He was speaking about a Tatiana Jefferson. All of you will remember and should say her name frequently. A Tatiana Jefferson was in her own home playing video games with her 8-year-old nephew when a neighbor, a Black neighbor, saw that her door was ajar. And moving from the best sense of neighborly love, he thought he could call police for a wellness check. But he forgot that police don't see us as people that need protection. They see us with targets. And so the police showed up in Fort Worth, Texas, peered through the window of a Tatiana Jefferson and shot her dead in front of her 8-year-old nephew. The truth is, we can't afford to call police on Black people or even for Black people because police see us with targets. And so as we talk about gun violence, gun safety, and gun control, let's think about it in the nuanced, complicated ways it applies to Black folks. That's coming up on The Call. So I'm very fortunate to bring onto this episode of The Call the Senior Project Manager for the Alliance for Safety and Justice, founder of the Reverence Project. I don't know what your title is in Newark, but you're the only person in the world I know that has more jobs than me. So this is Aqeela Sherrills, we've been best friends for 20-something years. Yeah, 20 plus but we years. Still 29.
Absolutely.
Right. But we first met doing community work, right?
Yes.
Doing work in Watts around really kind of a larger question of safety, right?
Yep.
Around trying to create sustainability in our neighborhoods, right?
Yes.
And so I remember when we first met, we were sitting in a circle. Mama Paula called the circle, and it was all of us who were doing work on this project, and you were sitting to my left. And you were saying good stuff, and I was like, we gonna be friends. We're talking about gun violence, gun safety, and gun control, but in this kind of larger question of building peace in communities, and specifically as it applies to Black folks. Because when we talk about gun violence, gun safety, and gun control, for Black people, it's also a complicated question, right?
Yes.
And so I wonder if you can just start by talking a little bit about your work, which is really kind of your life's work.
Most of my work started coming up in the neighborhood, growing up in Jordan housing projects, and being a child of the 80s and witnessing the crack cocaine trade blow through the neighborhood like Hurricane Katrina, uprooting families, literally destroying our neighborhood. And at the same time, it financed a war, in a sense, that was happening between folks in the community who were living out of their own wounds, in a sense, of poverty, right? So urban gang wars was the place that I kind of began to intersect this work. Lost a lot of friends in the late 80s, 1989, like 13 friends to gang violence, and had a transformative experience in college. In 92, myself and my brother and a group of friends, we organized a peace treaty between the major, warring factions in Watts. And then, this was a part of a larger movement that, Minister Farrakhan came to town in 1989 with the Stop the Killing tour that inspired a lot of Crips and Bloods to go to the sports arena and hear the message. And, as a representative of Grape Street and, the homies in the neighborhood, we, kind of carried the message about how can we bring an end, to this war that no one was winning in the neighborhood. And it changed the quality of life in the community. I mean, in the first 2 years of the peace treaty, gang homicides dropped 44%. As a direct result, they dismantled the crash unit in the neighborhood. Many commissioners who were serving as judges lost their jobs. And we learned real quick that law enforcement was deeply invested in the problem because they justified their budget based upon how much violence was happening in the neighborhood, giving them inflated overtime budgets, because anytime something happened, it's like,
So there's a whole industry that profits from violence in our communities.
That's right.
Yeah.
And even though we held the peace treaty in its original form for 12 years, today they still try to erase the peace treaty from the record books. I mean, there was a story in the Daily News that came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it talked about the 10 top reasons why gang violence decreased in the city, and not one of them named the peace treaty. So
after the peace treaty is negotiated, and we were sitting next to each other at some forum at USC. I don't even remember what the forum was on, but we were sitting together, and I had my new baby, Tandiwe.
Yes.
And of course we sat together because you my bestie, right?
Yes.
And we're sitting up talking, and I said, so how have you been? What's been going on? And you said Terrell had been killed, your son. And I remember thinking, like trying to kind of brace myself because I didn't want it to hit me emotionally because I didn't want to be emotional for you. I wanted to, I didn't know how to address that. Here I am, a new mom, and you're talking about the death of your son.
I had kids young and raised
a lot
four
of
of my
kids,
kids.
yeah.
Yes. I raised 4 of my kids as a single father. So, Terrell is my oldest son. The proudest day in my life was, him graduating from Bourbon Day and going to Humboldt State. And, getting him enrolled in school, meeting his dorm mates, spending a couple of days on the campus with him and stuff, you know, because Terrell was laying the foundation for his little brothers and sisters who would be coming right behind him, you know. And he came home, you know, from winter break, went to a party with some of his friends that he went to school with in Ladera Heights, and was shot to death at the party, you know. Like, I'm no novice to violence and death, you know. I grew up in the projects and witnessed it all my life. Right. But nothing ever prepares you for the loss of your child. And I'm fortunate that I've had really good people in my life in terms of my own spiritual practice. And one of the things that that I've always held is this belief that where the wounds are in the personal life is where the gift lie. And sometimes we have to sit.
Say that one more time.
Yes, that where the wounds are in the personal life is actually where the gift lie. So sometimes we have to sit long and hard in the anguish and the pain of the wound for the gift to actually manifest and show itself. And you have to be intentional about asking where it is, right? So when Terrell was murdered, that whole week, I felt like something was wrong. You know, I literally asked myself the night before if I was going to die. Because I felt this hole, like I was like, something's not right. And so when I get the call, you know, from his friend that he had been shot, I drove to the site, and the whole time I'm repeating the mantra in my head that, you know, that there's a gift in this tragedy, you know, and I'm looking for it. So when I get to the scene and, you know, they told me, hey, they took him to UCLA, you know, I went to the hospital and got the news that he didn't make it. And I mean, my whole life, you know, was shattered. I mean, yeah, man, it was surreal because my son was an amazing human being. And it's like, who would want to murder Terrell, right? But, you know, you know, you grew up in the neighborhood and, you know, we live in an environment, you know, I grew up in the culture in which an eye for an eye is a tooth, and, you know, they play that game, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's the cultural response in my neighborhood to the violence, right? And I was determined to not allow that to be the legacy for Terrell. So I was like, we're gonna harness the etheric energy of Terrell, and we're gonna do something much more profound with it. I'm like, so I asked his friends and my friends, I was like, don't go on a mission for Terrell. You know, I said, because honestly, I wouldn't want to see another parent like suffer through this heartache that I'm experiencing now, and that we can't really like afford to lose another one of our children. Right. My son's case has been a cold case for 15 years, you know, but you know, the streets talk. A week later, I had name, address, and phone number of the kid, permission from his partners to go and to kill his kid, you know, discovering that he was 17 years old. And I'm like, and I started asking the question, like, I wonder if what happened to him, you know, to cause him to have this calloused heart, you know, that he would take another human being's life, because you don't kill somebody and then the next day you skipping and singing and dancing. Right. I mean, you see your victims in face and dreams and imaginings and flashbacks. His life is intrinsically connected to Terrell's for the rest of his as a result of this initiation of taking a life. And so I hold space that, you know, and my life is so serendipitous, I know I'll meet him one day, right? I hold space for him that one day I'll get an opportunity to meet him and ask him, like, what happened? I want to meet his parents. I want to ask them, like, when did they lose connection with their child, or if they ever had a connection, right? Right. And then I want to work with him and his family and the criminal justice system, if there's a role for them in this overall process, to get him the proper counseling, therapy, or whatever healing modality is necessary. Because, you know, like Brian Stevenson said, I don't believe that people are their worst experiences. I don't believe that people are the things that they do, and they're not the things that have happened to them. These things are only informing who we become. They don't define who we are, right? And so I hold space because I know that our fate is connected. Right. And so I hold space for his healing. That as a result of this experience, that he has the capacity to give back 10 times that of the average person. You know, because it's a metamorphosing of the given idea. And I saw it happen like in the peace treaty. Like, it was the killers that turned the tide. And you know, these brothers decided that, you know what, it's time to do something different. You know, maybe some of them have to do 10, 15, 20 years in prison for them to have the awakening. But it was those cats that we brought to the table that was saying, okay, I'm giving you a pass, you giving me a pass. And it created a portal, an opening, you know, for a much, you know, more profound conversation to happen. And we were able to, you know, to really change, you know, the environment in which we lived in. And so for me, that was already a lesson that I was building on. You know, I saw this as an opportunity, you know, to really be able to transform our relationship to violence in the community.
So welcome to the call. Welcome to our roundtable. This is one of my dream roundtables. We have so many perspectives and so many sets of experiences. We have Trudy Goodwin, who I affectionately call, and many of us call Mama True, who was an organizer with the Black Panther Party and organizes now with the Los Angeles Community Action Network, spent her life in the work of Black liberation. So welcome to the call, Mama True.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joining us back at the round table is Aqeela Sherrills, who's one of my best friends in the world, who does work on building peace in communities, work in Newark, work in Los Angeles, but also work nationally, redefining public safety. Yes. And we also have my spirit nephew, who I've adopted. I hope that's okay, Matthew.
That's all good. We need.
Matthew is an organizer with March for Our Lives, with the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard. He's a freshman at California State University, Northridge, and one of the best human beings I know. And so we're going to get into this conversation around gun violence, gun safety, and gun control. But we're complicating the conversation because we're talking about it from a Black perspective. So we hear, you know, kind of a liberal casting of why we need gun control, why we need gun safety, why we need to address gun violence. But a lot of that omits the history of Black people and neglects the history of Black people and experiences of Black people, especially in this country. And so one of the things that often comes up for me is that the state has never been a source of safety for Black folks. So the concept of self-defense and the practice of Black self-defense has been core to our survival and also to our quest for Black freedom. And so we can go all the way back, right, to Mama Harriet having to arm herself and others as we took our own freedom, right? We can think about, you know, the securing of Black towns like Rosewood, like Tulsa, right? We can think about the Deacons for Defense. We can think about theorists and practitioners like Robert F. Williams, and who most people, the group most people will be familiar with is the Black Panther Party for self-defense, right?
That's right.
Mama Trudy, you were a member of the Black Panther Party for self-defense.
Right.
Can you help us to kind of understand why there needs to be a Black approach to our own self-defense, and why the Black Panther Party at the same time they were pushing back against police brutality, also talked about securing Black communities and arming ourselves?
That's right, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up Robert Williams, because it's through the Black armed guards that the Panther Party came up with the idea of self-defense. They looked at Robert Williams' work and saw how he was protecting the people in Alabama and realized that this was something that we needed in California, if not across the nation. The Panthers started out with believing that the only way that they were going to be able to protect themselves and their community was if they stood up against police brutality and against vigilantism with guns and saying, you know, if a police officer was to stop a young man, the Panthers would go out on the corner with their guns, instructing that person that had been stopped about what their rights were and what they didn't have to do. And the whole time making their presence known to the police department so that they would know that their guns were trained on them as the police were training their guns on the people that they stopped. And that actually was so successful, Melina, that the state ended up passing a law that controlled whether or not folks in California could carry weapons out in the open.
Because prior to the Panthers, you couldn't carry a concealed weapon.
Right.
But there's a loophole in the law. It doesn't say anything about unconcealed weapons.
Right.
And so the Panthers used the law to benefit them and to benefit our community and to say, let's be armed.
Right. Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
In a posturing, though, of self-defense. And I think that's an important distinction, because when we think about Robert F. Williams, right, he actually, there was a rift in the NAACP. Robert F. Williams was a leader of in the NAACP.
Right.
But because of white terrorism in black communities, he was about black people being able to defend ourselves, right? And so it wasn't about arming ourselves for the sake of aggression.
Right.
It's about defending our communities. So can you just kind of underscore that distinction a bit?
Absolutely. You know, and I think it's really important that we do that, because over the decades, the Panthers have been painted with this broad brush of being violent and wanting to murder non-black people. And nothing could have been further from the truth. What they were saying was that our community was under attack by whites, predominantly white police. And what they wanted to do was to make sure that our youth and our brothers and sisters were safe when they went out on the street. And by setting up this party of self-defense, they were working on the side of black folks to make sure that when they went out in the street, if the police did stop them, at least they had someone there to protect them. And it's very much like Robert Williams, because he was doing the exact same thing. It was like he saw where blacks were being attacked and band together these 50 to 60 people to protect the people in Alabama.
Right. There's a brilliant book on the concept of black self-defense by Aqeela Sherrills called We Will Shoot Back.
That's right.
That talks about this whole history. I caught myself reading it on the plane one time, and the white person next to me was looking at me, and I was like, oh, maybe this is not good plane reading. Let me put this away, right? But we hope everybody who watches the call will get that book, We Will Shoot Back by Aqeela Sherrills. What do you think about the concept of armed self-defense now? And this is really for all of us. Let's start with this. What do you think about gun ownership, and do you own a gun?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
So, obviously I don't own a gun. But
Why?
I'm too young. Well,
Oh, is it 21 or 18?
it's definitely not 18, I know that.
I think you can own a rifle at 18, but a handgun at 21, I think.
That's actually ridiculous. But I don't see anything wrong with owning a gun. I just feel like just being responsible and knowing like what you need a gun for. Like no one in their right mind needs an assault rifle, right?
Right.
So the thing is though, like you said, black people, the state has never been like working for black people. It's always been something we've been fighting against because they've done so many like horrendous things in the past. So I don't see anything wrong with owning a gun. It's just being smart about it and knowing that there is a problem with gun violence in this country.
And that's really interesting for you to say, because you're with March for Our Lives, right? And so when we think about March for Our Lives and the kids who came out of the mass shooting in Parkland, Florida, and this whole youth movement around gun safety, there's kind of a mainstream conversation and narrative about, you know, nobody should own a gun, right? But you're pointing out this tension, though. Well, what about black people, right? We kind of can't depend on anybody else to protect us but us, right? So has that conversation emerged in your circles?
For sure. Because the whole thing is, I don't want anybody to think like March for Our Lives is trying to just get away, like all guns have to go away. That's never been the plan. It's always been about just being smart about the guns you own, and again, like recognizing that there's a huge problem with gun violence in this country. But yeah, there's never been a problem with people owning guns. It's just, and like we understand, like I've had conversations with a lot of people from National and like all that stuff from March for Our Lives, and they understand what the state has done to black people before, and they understand why a lot of black people would feel that need. So it's not.
I do want to get back to that as we kind of move this conversation forward, because something is happening in your movement that I told you before we started filming that I think is different in our generations, right? Around the kinds of conversations that you're able to have within the movement between black folks and non-black folks, and the responsiveness to the black perspective on these issues. So I want to hold on to that so we can talk about that. It's really encouraging to me what's happening within your movement. What about you, Aqeela?
Yeah, I own guns. I ain't giving up my guns. I have a rifle, I have a couple of handguns, and I am a big believer in the Second Amendment because exactly what Matthew was saying and what Mama True was saying. You know, we have had the experience of watching COINTELPRO destroy black folks just because they were standing up to defend themselves against excessive, police, force. And you know, so the work that I do around redefining public safety, which is training non-traditional leaders to be public safety professionals, is essentially about getting rid of police in our neighborhood, right? Because I'm like, first of all, the black and brown community should be the safest communities in the country, right? And so if we stand up and learn, public safety protocol and policy and the standard operating procedures, I think that, and that's what our whole strategy is, that we decrease the need for police in our neighborhood. And I was at an event a couple of years ago in Newark, in which the representative from Patterson, Black Lives Matter representative from Patterson, was speaking on a panel, and he said that our goal is to rid our community from police like 100%, and people chuckled and laughed in the audience. But but then when he came back and qualified it, because in the city of Newark, right, 80% of the residents of the area out of all those districts experience no violence, no gun violence.
What about you?
I totally, that is exactly the way that I feel. And we are not alone. What statistics are showing now is that black folks are purchasing guns at a rate of 20% over white gun purchases. So that's telling you that black folks in this country do not feel safe. And while I'm constantly telling my neighbors, every time I see on TV where they're having a gun buyback, it's like, do not give up your weapon. Right. Let them go out there and buy back the guns from the people in the valley. They only do the buybacks
in our neighborhoods.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. So I own guns, and I was trained to fire and clean and put back together guns when I was in the Panther Party. And from little, I have been taught that this is a way of making sure that no one takes advantage of me.
Do you think that there's a concerted effort to keep black folks from having guns?
Many of our social activists, allies, and friends lost their rights to have a gun just because they were involved in a social action where they sat down in the middle of the street, or they took out, some chalk to write a message. They lost their rights to carry guns, or to receive a gun permit. The other thing is, I don't know of any black folks whose family didn't originate out of the South.
Right.
If you come in from the South, you were raised around guns. My great-grandmother at 93 saved my little 5-year-old life running across the field with dogs, wild dogs chasing me. Got up out of her bed, grabbed her shotgun, shot off one in the air, and the dogs left me alone. So we grew up understanding the necessity of guns.
The thing is that the majority of folks, like say in terms of urban violence and gun injury, the majority of those folks ain't going into no store and buying no gun and get no permit. So the majority of folks in the neighborhood don't go to get permits. And so they'll never be able to count like who has a gun and who don't have a gun.
That's a good point.
And so I'm like, I'm not advocating for illegally purchasing guns, but I'm like, get your gun, by any means necessary.
So if we're saying there should be some gun rights, you said you're an advocate of the Second Amendment, right? Then they automatically align you with the NRA. But we know the NRA is not actually a gun rights organization. It's a white supremacist organization. They didn't do anything when Philando Castile was killed by the police, right? They don't care about black gun rights. What they're talking about is white supremacy, right? So how do we then say that there has to be some right to our own self-defense without then being... before we started filming, we were talking about Kanye West, right? We don't want to be Kanye West, right? We don't want to be kind of pulled into a right-wing narrative, which you do start to see some kind of black advocates of self-determination kind of being courted by the right. So how do we maintain our position? We will shoot back, right? Black armament, and it sounds like this is kind of our, we all agree, there's some consensus at the table that without the state being trusted to protect us, there has to be some way for community to protect themselves, right? So if that's the consensus, how do we advocate from that position and that consensus without being pulled in to a right-wing narrative that claims, okay, well, if you're a Second Amendment advocate, then you must be aligned with Trump and the NRA and the violent white supremacists?
Well, I would say that it's really a question of safety. And as you said earlier, what safety looks like for black people is not what safety looks like for white folks. And we have to acknowledge that there is two Americas, and there's always has been, that there's a different standard. Rarely have black folks ever gotten any justice from the criminal justice system when it comes to the harm that we've experienced in the neighborhood, because the system still doesn't view black people as human. That's the narrative that it holds, and I think that so there's a lot of policy conversations that are happening, with groups like Mom Demand Action and in these groups and stuff, to try to change gun policy and gun laws. I'm like, we might not agree with you politically and philosophically, but I'm like, if we don't heal from the trauma, and a part of advancing this policy conversation is how are we defining safety? Because to me, safety is not low crime stats in the neighborhood. That doesn't define whether or not one feels safe. So safety is about the presence. It's about well-being, and it's about the infrastructure to support well-being in people's respective healing journey. Because I can't tell you how many cases, we provide direct services to victims and survivors of violent crime in the neighborhood, right? I can't tell you how many cases that we've worked on in which someone is harmed or someone is being threatened to be harmed, and they go down to the police department to try to file a report so that they can get emergency relocation through the district attorney's or the prosecutor's office, and they're denied because they're like, a crime hasn't been committed. And the brother's like, yo, like, hey, man, Raheem them, they keep on, I ain't no punk. They keep on running up on me and stuff. I'm going to protect myself.
Right.
And then you harm, then you hurt somebody, because you have to protect yourself, and then you lose your victim status. You lose your ability to access resources and services and all different types of things to support you. And so I think that we have to advance a whole nother policy conversation, similar to what we've done in the state around victims. But the primary narrative was being driven by upper middle class white women who had been harmed, and they were pushing all of the 3 strikes laws that lock our children up as adults. But the reality is that, those who are highly victimized in the state were people of color.
Real quickly about this NRA thing and how we need to stay separated out from that narrative. I believe that the easiest way of keeping that separation and making it known that this is not our movement, this is the NRA is not part of this, is by just looking at their record, just pointing out their record, the money that went into prohibiting Panthers from being able to carry weapons was from the NRA. It was the first time that group actually came out and said, yeah, we're for gun control, where it affects black folks. Right. So I think it's important that we keep that distance, and I don't think that it's really difficult given their history.
We're all familiar with what just happened to Tatiana Jefferson in Fort Worth, Texas. That we're often tricked into believing that the state is there for us, that police are there to protect and serve. And so my heart is broken for Tatiana Jefferson, who was killed by a Fort Worth police officer as she was playing video games with her nephew, probably having the time of his life because it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. I hear she was the fun auntie. She was also the one that was kind of the gel of her family, right? And so, it breaks for her and her family and her nephew. I just think about, my son is 9, and what kind of trauma he must be experiencing. You always talk about healing justice. What kind of healing work is going to have to happen for him to recover from this? But I also think about the brother who called the police for her. And he did what he thought was helping. He called the police, called the non-emergency line, explicitly said, we need a wellness check because her door is open, right? And then the police come and murder her in a span of seconds. So I think about both of them, right? But I also want to know what that means for us. So I've adopted a position of I don't call the police, right? Also for my own survival, I don't call the police. Would you ever call the police on or for black people? Mama True, I already know the answer, but I'm asking anyway.
It's like, no. And I think that the death of this young woman, what it is pointing to is the need for communities to band together and to be more aware of who each other are and how we can help, And my heart breaks for him because he said, if I just hadn't called the police, she would still be alive. Right. So.
And he seems tormented. Right?
He is tormented. He is, So I think that calls upon us to build stronger community ties and systems. We had the sisters down south that would stop the police before they'd even get in the neighborhood and ask them, how can I help you, sir? Right. Right. And they knew the folks in their community and knew what folks were up to. And I think that that's what it's going to take. When they talk about community policing, It's a whole different vision in my head. It's little old ladies like me that ask him, why are you over there? You know, I think that's what it takes.
Right. What about you?
Yeah, I think that two things. If there's a dude outside and and he has a gun, I'm probably gonna call the police to save his life and to save my own, because I'm like this. If you got a gun and you threatening my life, I might shoot you. You know what I'm saying? Like straight up, okay? And the thing is this: nobody wins in that type of dynamic.
As the only young black man sitting at this table, would you ever call the police?
I feel like, personally, that's not the first thing I'm gonna go to in any situation. I think, like you were saying, how if there's somebody outside with a gun, I feel like in that situation, I'm not gonna go outside and do nothing. I mean, I'm sure would call the police in a situation like that. But in any other situation, I don't see the reason. Like, people loitering, what do you need the police there for? These are armed people. Like, those are not the people that should be solving a problem like that. And I think that a lot more people just, I remember you tweeted about this. You just said, stop calling the police on black people.
Right. Right. Let's get 30-second closing thoughts. Let's start with you, Matthew.
Well, this is just about something that's been on my mind through the conversation. And I think that a lot of the time there is a stigma that comes with mental illness and guns, and just in general with mental illness. Because there have been studies that show that people who are mentally ill are a lot more prone to being the victim of gun violence than the actual perpetrators. So I think that, I don't think the conversation ends there when talking about mental illness. Like, we need to just fix the people and then they won't be up shooting places. But it is definitely important that we recognize that, because it can be a problem. But they are a lot more of the times victims, and I think we should also take that into consideration.
Yeah, public safety is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And again, safety is not only the absence of violence, it's the presence of well-being and the infrastructure to support people on a respective healing journey. And I think that we have to invest more money in advocacy and in groups like Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, in groups like the Vanguard and like Black Lives Matter, so that we could raise our collective voices and move these dollars, because it's essentially if victims and survivors of violence and violent crime are the fulcrum in the conversation around, because that's who law enforcement, correction, this is all, everybody, they're saying that that's what they're protecting, right? So if we're saying that we're not being protected, then we have to raise our voices in a more strategic way to be able to shift those dollars into new funds.
Great. Mama Trudy?
I think all across the world where you find communities, intact communities, and this is just about on every continent you can go to. There's a sense of community that is built up. I have a baby and I need someone to watch that baby. Someone in the village is watching my kid. You don't have to, when you have a community that works together, then you don't have to worry about whether or not you have child care, whether or not your kids are actually going to, make something with their lives, because folks work towards that. I honestly believe that the only way that we're going to get out of this mess is if we figure out a way for Black folks to become more supportive of one another and working together. And, and that's the way we abolish prisons. That's the way we get better education for our kids. That's the way we become progressive monetarily.
As we're wrapping in our conversation about gun violence, gun safety, and gun control, I think that what's coming out of the conversation is that it's much bigger than guns, right? That when we talk about violence and safety, so let's take the gun off, violence and safety, right? We're really talking about how do we move towards peaceful communities. And what I'm hearing, and I don't want to put words in your mouths, but what I hear in common from all three of you is it's the building of community trust, right? I don't think Aqeela's as far as you are, Mama True, or I am in terms of, I think we could abolish them right now and I ain't never calling them, right?
Yes.
I think that's kind of where you are and where I am. But I think that we all kind of have an eye, and tell me if I'm wrong, Matthew, for getting there, where we do have self-defined, self-determined, peaceful, well communities where we can all not just survive, but grow into our fullest selves. And that comes with the work that we do in building community. Trudy Goodwin is an organizer at the Los Angeles Community Action Network. You can follow her work there. Aqeela Sherrills, which organization do you want me to introduce? The Reverence Project.
The Alliance for Safety and Justice.
The Alliance for Safety and Justice. And Matthew Kahsay is with March for Our Lives and with the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard. Thank you all for being my guests, for helping us on the call.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching The Call. We close every show with a call to action, tangible steps that we can take to usher in the world in which we want to live. Let's start by reading. We've been hearing a lot about the need for Black self-defense. We want to encourage you all to read We Will Shoot Back by Aqeela Sherrills. Second, we want you to understand that our dollars make a difference. When we talk about police violence as also gun violence, we have to take a stance against police violence. And we also have to understand that oftentimes corporations are complicit in the murders of Black people at the hands of police. In both 2017 and 2018, in two separate incidents, 24 Hour Fitness called the police on two Black male members. In 2017, they called on Dennis Todd Rogers, and in 2018, they called on Albert Ramon Dorsey. Both of those calls resulted in the murders of these Black men. We repeatedly reached out to 24 Hour Fitness and asked them to agree to 3 simple steps. 1, issue a statement affirming the value of Black life. 2, have your employees and franchisees undergo cultural competency training. And 3, developing a protocol other than calling police when it's a non-life-threatening situation. Bank Black, move your money. Take it out of the white-owned banks that financed the Dakota Access Pipeline, that fund private prisons, and that engage in practices that oppress Black communities, and move your dollars to Black-owned banks. Build Black. Join an organization that's committed to Black liberation, whether it be Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard, March for Our Lives, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, or the Los Angeles Community Action Network. We also want you to remember, as we gear up for the 2020 elections, it's important to engage the candidates for president. It's important to push them on Black issues. Black Lives Matter is encouraging people to use the hashtag #WhatMatters2020. But beyond the presidential race, we also have down ballot races that are sometimes more important to our day-to-day lives than the office of the presidency. We want you to pay special attention to the role of district attorneys. District attorney races are hugely important. They're who determines who gets charged, who doesn't get charged, and what those charges are. In all too many cases, district attorneys choose not to charge police who perpetrate crimes, including the murders of our people. So we want you to look closely at the district attorney in your locale. If you're in Los Angeles, our district attorney is Jackie Lacey. Since she took office in 2013, more than 550 people have been killed by law enforcement, and she chooses not to prosecute those officers. We encourage you to join the Buy Jackie 2020 Jackie Lacey Must Go campaign. In Los Angeles, every Wednesday, we protest on her front porch at 211 West Temple Street. Join that effort at 4 p.m. every Wednesday. We hope that you'll take a step, do something, be the response to this call. Thank you for watching The Call. I'm MELINA Abdullah. Until next time, peace.